A disaster now stretching across almost 7 years. Charges land in the Flint water crisis, including 2 against former Governor Snyder. And Wednesday is Inauguration Day for Joe Biden. Is the table set for success, failure, or something in between? Today is Sunday, January 17th, 2021, and this is Flashpoint. Hi, welcome to Flashpoint after another week in which we could barely report on one development before another was begging for our attention. It was a week marked by unpleasant firsts. Donald Trump becoming the first president to be impeached twice. A little later on, we're going to talk about what's ahead with the start of the Joe Biden presidency launching on Wednesday. But this week also marked the first time a Michigan governor was hit with charges for misconduct in office. And that's where we're going to start today. We have devoted so much of this program to the water problems in Flint over these last several years, and yet it was jarring to stop and think about how long Flint residents waited for the moment that arrived on Thursday. Many of them were dismayed and or frustrated when Attorney General Dana Nessel started the whole investigation over after she took office. But the indictments piled up in extraordinary fashion Thursday. 42 counts leveled against 9 different people, including former Governor Snyder, his former chief of staff, the former director of Health and Human Services, the state's former chief medical officer, and 2 former emergency managers for the city of Flint. Snyder's attorney said the prosecution is a travesty, but we must note some residents of Flint feel the same way, thinking the governor got off lightly. Fadwa Hamoud and Kim Worthy didn't release much in the way of evidence as they announced the indictments, but a reporting team at The Intercept has been doing some really extraordinary digging. And in just a minute, we're going to talk with one of them about what they found and just how damning it is. And our Hank Winchester will be along to talk about Flint today, both the reaction of residents to the charges and the day-to-day struggles that they still face because of the water problems that began nearly 7 years ago. It's all today on Flashpoint. Well, as I mentioned, the prosecuting team in the Flint crisis has not really given us much in the way of evidence yet, but a duo at The Intercept, Jordan Sheraton and Jen Dyes, have been doing some extraordinary reporting for several years now, including this week's report detailing a trail of phone calls surrounding the outbreak of Legionnaire's disease. Good to have Jordan Sheraton back with us on Flashpoint again. And Jordan, let me start with this most recent report. You found a lot of phone traffic going on between the governor's office and health officials, though that doesn't include the content of those calls. So is the existence of the calls incriminating? I know you believe it's pretty incriminating, but is it enough to say that the governor knew much more and much earlier than he has claimed?
Yeah, it's not that I conclude. The original prosecution concluded that this avalanche of phone calls that were actually sandwiched. If you look back in time, October 2014, these calls that happened on October 16th and 17th, they were sandwiched in between a lot of other emails and phone calls going on exactly about the Legionella outbreak in Flint. Environmental officials were calling about the Legionella outbreak. A health department official who was the subject matter expert on Legionella, she had sent an email 3 days before these calls saying, my hypothesis is it's the Flint water causing the outbreak, not McLaren Hospital. And then all of a sudden on these 2 days, Governor Snyder's chief of staff and health director, they're on the phone 9 times in 2 days, and 4 of those calls, right when they hang up, the chief of staff calls the health director. Important to note, the investigators only found one other time that the chief of staff and the health director had spoken before those 9 calls in August. So, it's up to people in Flint and others to figure out, what were they talking about. But I will say one of the second day of those phone calls, 2 of those calls came right after an email was sent. The governor's office is involved in Flint's water problems and the Legionella outbreak.
There were a lot of people, I believe, that were kind of blown away by the scope of the indictments of this past week, 42 counts. You and Jen, though, much more intimately involved in an understanding of the way that this case has been built by both teams. What was your reaction when you saw the number of charges and the number of people being charged?
Some of the charges that Attorney General Nessel's team put forward, I think we're right on the money, particularly the governor's top advisor, some called his right-hand man, Richard Baird.
Yeah.
Some of those charges, I believe, are based on some of what we reported, which were alleged payoffs of sick residents, alleged obstruction of justice, trying to get officials from the Snyder administration on the same page, telling the same story before they went and spoke with investigators. In terms of Governor Snyder, they have not presented their evidence, so I can't really speak to it. But what I do know is the original investigative team, they concluded, based on the documents I have, that there was enough to charge misconduct in office, neglect of duty, and I have multiple sources familiar with the matter, that they were gunning for involuntary manslaughter. And at the time that they were dismissed, they were fairly close. I don't want to put a percentage, but they were building up, and that there were defendants cooperating at the time they were dismissed. And since our report went up, there's two other reporters that have independently confirmed that the original investigation was going for involuntary manslaughter.
That was the original team put together by then Attorney General Bill Schuette, including Todd Flood and others. There's something counterintuitive here then. I think everybody has all along wondered what kind of political influence might be brought to bear on this. But your sense then is that the prosecuting team that was Republican in makeup and put together by Republicans would have been tougher on a Republican former governor than the Democratic team that ended up announcing the charges this week. Is that the way that you see it?
Well, there is a part two coming out. There was definitely some obstruction among Snyder and his attorneys in providing the original team documents, emails, briefings. And I do believe that Attorney General Bill Schuette, not that he directly allowed it, but that part of why that type of obstruction was enabled was because Bill Schuette was the Attorney General, and he was also running, frankly, to replace Rick Snyder. So all I could say is, based on the reporting we have and the documentation we have, the original prosecution, which was a team of probably over 30 investigators, former FBI, former judges, that they were going to charge Snyder with more. I can't speak to why the current team, which Attorney General Nessel, to be clear, says she was not involved. She recused herself. Right. Why they felt there was less evidence. According to them, it's still an ongoing investigation, so theoretically they can charge more. But based on the information I have, there was definitely, including not just the calls, there was a briefing found that was sent to the governor that mentioned Legionella in October 2014, and other evidence that he was aware of what was going on. Yeah. So, I don't know why one investigation was able to find significantly more, but, based on what they're saying now, they could potentially charge more.
Well, it's been some real shoe leather reporting that you've done. I really appreciate the work you've put into it and sharing it with us. Thanks so much, Jordan.
Thank you so much.
All right, and now let's turn to my colleague here at Local 4, Hank Winchester, who has pretty much set up a mailing address in Flint over these years. What's the reaction been there? Hank, talk a little bit about, I think a lot of people thought they'd been forgotten as far as the prosecution goes. Charges now filed. What was the reaction to it?
And Devin, can you blame the people of Flint for thinking that this case was over? I mean, it's been so many years and the investigation changed hands. I think there's a lot of mixed reaction. Here's the thing. People are very happy that they feel like there's justice now and there are charges, that people will be in court and they'll have to answer to what happened. But I also think overall there was some great disappointment regarding the governor, the former governor, Rick Snyder. I think a lot of people within the city of Flint were hoping for a manslaughter charge. We didn't see that. But at the end of the day, I think the overall feeling is that people are eager to see this play out in court and finally have some people in court facing these charges.
In fact, some of that, what we heard even from the former mayor, Karen Weaver, yesterday, she was very clearly disappointed, which kind of overshadowed the length of charges that went against, say, Rich Baird.
It does, Devin. And, Weaver has a lot of interesting perspective because, remember, she was working very closely with Rick Snyder during this entire time.
Right.
She's been a little quiet regarding what he may have known and exactly when, but she made it very clear in talking with her that she believed that a manslaughter charge was necessary.
Yeah. Hank, the other thing, I think that there's probably an almost natural sense among people who don't live in Flint to think, well, 7 years later, certainly this has all been taken care of. We've talked about the new pipes going in. There are still so many people, and you talk to a lot of these families, you've stayed in touch with them now for years. There's a lot of people now who still cannot drink their water.
The majority of people in Flint, even if they've had their pipes changed, still do not trust the water. And the reality is that this all unfolded and was exposed about 6 years ago. At that time, it was headline news every day. The national networks were in. There were food banks. There were water stations. Right. Big celebrities were making huge donations. Well, that's come and gone. There are a few water centers around the city of Flint. There are a few people that are still helping out. But the city is still struggling. And more importantly, those that have already been affected by the lead, remember, that's going to continue for years and years. Flint is still a city that is absolutely struggling right now.
Some of these children will obviously be tested for many, many years to find the lingering effects. But does Flint feel forgotten now, Hank?
I think that there's a sense that they feel forgotten. Of course, they're looking forward to this legal settlement, hoping that, that $500 or $600 million makes its way to the city to help those impacted. But of course, they're very cautious. They have no idea how this is going to play out. And because they do not trust government and government officials, they're very concerned about how that payout is actually going to make its way to people that are being impacted still every single day.
Hank Winchester, who has spent so much time in and on the Flint matter. Hank, thanks for the time, and we'll see you soon. We'll bring in the roundtable next. We'll talk about the state of affairs in Flint and the State of the Union. This is Flashpoint on Local 4.
FanDuel's simple app makes it easy to get closer to the game. But to get Dan even closer, we've arranged for him to experience a genuine James Harrison tackle.
Wait, what?
Oh, kick! FanDuel. Play free all season.
Love lower than low prices? Then get more ways to save at Kroger, where you can find personalized coupons, weekly deals, and rewards like fuel points. All for prices that are lower than low. On food that's fresher than fresh. Kroger, fresh for everyone.
Visit GollingBloomfield.com and lease or buy your next vehicle online. Only at Golling Chrysler Dodge Jeep Ram in Bloomfield Hills. During the Start Something New sales event, lease the 2021 Jeep Compass 8th Anniversary Edition 4x4 for only $189 a month employee, $229 friends and family. Or take home the 2021 Jeep Compass Limited 4x4 starting at $199 a month employee, $229 friends and family. You search, you request, we deliver to your home or office. Shop GollingBloomfield.com. Golling Chrysler Dodge Jeep Ram in Bloomfield Hills.
Tune in to Local 4 this Sunday at 12:30 p.m. for Live Triumphantly with Pastor Solomon Kinlock Jr. Don't just survive. The Word shows us how to thrive.
Come into a California Closet showroom and be inspired. Collaborate with one of our expert designers. Together, you'll create the perfect space to fit your style and budget. Visit a showroom or schedule your free consultation today.
Ellen's back in studio for season 18.
Weekdays at 3 on Local 4.
All right, let's bring on our roundtable for today. Good to have with us Jill Alper from Alper Strategies, Steve Mitchell, pollster and analyst from Mitchell Research, Nolan Fenley, editorial page editor of the Detroit News, and Chastity Pratt, Detroit-based reporter for the Wall Street Journal. And Chastity, let me start with you. You have written and talked a lot about what happened in Flint. 9 state officials now caught up in charges. What was your reaction as you started to look at the charges and the breadth of them?
Well, I'm not a reporter anymore. I'm an editor.
Well, yes, sorry.
But I mean, this idea that the charges would have been different under Schuette, I don't know about that. He was Republican. He was in there during some of the time all this was happening. I don't know if those charges would have been worse. There's a lot here. And in the end, and ultimately, I think people in Flint have been waiting a long time for this. We have, the biggest issue in Flint is trust in government. This destroyed the trust in government in Flint. And people have been waiting, 7 years, since they first started shaking those bottles of brown water at the state saying, look, do something about this. So there's going to be a lot that people are looking at to say whether to charge a stick or not, how hard the state goes after them. People are looking to see, is something going to happen that's going to restore Flint's trust in government?
Yeah. Steve Mitchell, let me get your take on what we saw. It was interesting looking at the faces in the mugshots, the court appearances, which happened by video on Thursday. Clearly, a lot of people there that never, ever expected to be on that side of the courtroom.
I think that there was a very interesting comment made to Bridge Magazine back in November of 2018. And it's, quote, "I have long been a critic of the way in which Bill Schuette has handled the Flint water crisis investigation. He is merely an opportunist who has used the crisis to further his political ambitions by a series of politically charged show trials. The entire process has been highly suspect." That quote is from Dana Nessel from 2018. I think when you start charging public officials for making decisions as a part of the way they do their work, never intending to be doing anything criminal when they make those decisions, you're really crossing a barrier that should not be crossed. What happens if the Enbridge line closes up and somebody freezes up in the Upper Peninsula to death? Are they going to go after Dana Nessel because she was responsible for shutting it down? I just think this is an egregious attempt to charge individuals. You look at what they've done and how well they responded to this. There was never any criminal intent involved in any of this, and I just find it outrageous.
Nolan Fenley, your thoughts? Was there intent is one thing, but we're talking about perjury, people who knew better than to say some of the things that they said, and a record that seems to suggest that people knew things before they admitted they did.
I don't know. These charges very seriously. Obviously, I think they risk criminalizing public service, but we don't yet have much information about the background surrounding these charges. They were issued with an unusually small amount of information, but I would agree with Steve, and more relevant and closer is the fact that I think it leaves Governor Whitmer vulnerable to charges, and I write that this morning, leaves her vulnerable to being charged in her handling of the COVID-19 crisis, because a lot of people died in nursing homes with people advising the governor, begging the governor to change her policies. Now, I don't think the governor acted with ill intent there. I don't think Snyder acted with ill intent. They might both have got something wrong. That should not expose you to criminal charges as a public official.
Jill, people have wondered over the years about charging people for the way that they carry out their public office duties could have a chilling effect on obviously the people who decide whether or not they want to run for office. But I'm trying to imagine the people of Flint, if there weren't charges filed, the way that they would have felt. This would have been, I think many of them would have felt very aggrieved and forgotten.
Right. Well, it's very nuanced. It's very complicated, and I'm sure there are many layers to this onion. It would give, I think, anybody serious pause about wanting to serve with this kind of responsibility. But there is an accountability that goes along with being in the chair. So the questions need to be asked. The information eventually needs to be shared. It needs to see the light of day, and people need to be held to account. If there were things that were done that were egregious, I do agree. I don't think anybody involved had malicious intent to harm people. Though people died, actions were or weren't taken, and soon enough, I think we'll learn the truth. And for the community of Flint to heal, all of this has to be on the table, unearthed, discussed, and justice must be brought. The Attorney General, I believe, and the prosecutors are going to play this by the book.
Kevin, if I may, justice doesn't always mean sticking somebody in jail.
Sure.
I agree that the people of Flint need to be compensated for the damages they suffered. They need to be made whole. But that doesn't necessarily mean destroying another group of people, dragging them through the courts and sticking them in jail.
Nolan, let me let Chastity jump in there because I want to move on to the next topic here real quick. But go ahead, Chastity.
I think the one question that people want to see come out in this court case is, what did they know and when did they know it, right? Not so much, intent, but there's, the question of, did Rich Baird, who is a native of Flint, did he lie to investigators during the whole process of fact finding? And did the governor and his advisors know that the water was bad well before they told the people of Flint? What did they know and when did they know it?
Yeah. All right, I want to quickly move on. We've only got about 4 minutes left, which leaves about a minute for each of you to give me your take on the State of the Union as we're now 3 days away from the inauguration of Joe Biden. And Steve Mitchell, let me start with you. What is the state of the United States right now?
We are deeply divided by a 4% margin. Joe Biden won. That division is the same today as it was, despite everything that occurred on January 6th. Let me share some poll data from YouGov and Economist magazine. How much confidence do you have that the 2020 election was held fairly? Trump voters, 60%, none at all. 21%, only a little. How much voter fraud do you think occurred in this election? Among Trump voters, 71%, a lot. 25%, a little. That's 96%. You think that voter fraud changed the results in some of the states? Enough fraud to change who won the election? 84% of Trump voters believe that, and 57% of independents believe that. You think Trump ought to resign? 10% of Trump voters, 90% of Biden voters, but by a split 43 to 43%, independents are tied. You think President Trump should be removed from office? 5% of the Trump voters believe that, 93% of the Biden voters, and 43 to 47 independents. And finally, here we are in the poll conducted 4 days after the problems in Washington, D.C. What is Trump's job approval among Trump voters? 49% strongly approve, 34% approve somewhat. That's 83% of Trump voters, despite everything that's happened, still approve of the job he's doing.
Paints a picture of a deeply divided nation. Jill, how about you?
Right. I think the country is divided for sure. We see that in the data. We also see, though, that a lot of Americans do not approve of what took place in the last week. And we're hoping for everybody, when the clock struck 2021 for a new day. Joe Biden stood up yesterday, stood up to give an eloquent speech about the future, about wresting COVID and improving our economy. And I'm going to keep my fingers crossed that we're going to turn the page. Now, there still is a question about the impeachment of the president, and it seems like the Senate is still sorting its way forward in terms of process. So there's going to be more pain ahead. But the most important thing I think Americans are feeling is the importance of restoring our democracy and for people being held accountable when they're out of line, not respecting the rule of law, our elections, and the way a constructive society works. So we're polarized, but hopeful.
Nolan and Chastity, I'm just about out of time. You guys get the short end of the stick, but I want to let you both weigh in. Nolan, you first, quickly.
Well, I'd echo Steve. Trump leaves office among a certain percentage of the population, a large percentage, one of the most despised president in history, and among a significant portion of the population, one of the most beloved. And that's where we are. That
really says a lot. And Chastity, you get the last word.
So my question is this Million Militia March going to cause a big kerfluffle, a big, siege or whatever during the inauguration? And then ultimately, the United States is supposed to be this beacon of democracy. And the question remains, we've always been polarized, always, always, always. But is that going to continue to show itself on the world stage? Are we going to continue to see our democracy fray publicly? And, or will we see our national leaders now and moving forward stand up, get along in some way that shows the rest of the world that we can protect democracy and move on?
And that's where we stand this morning. Thanks so much, gang. I got to leave it there. I got to get to a break. Thanks for the time. Back with more in just a minute.